Mostly mindless top-down twin-stick action which is oddly satisfying and easy to just keep playing. This is Hero Siege, a top-down action-packed roguelite with elements borrowed from RPGs and twin-stick shooters which combines consistent progression with loss-on-death mechanics to try and make backtracking a valuable tool. The story is pretty generic. A bunch of monks brought together the segments of an evil talisman and awoke hordes of demons which are only the first step before Satan rises, and you are one of the few selected heroes that must work together in order to end this evil prophecy. You are thrown straight in at the deep end with no real tutorials, but fortunately it's pretty obvious what you're supposed to be doing. And the finer details are easy enough to pick up as you start putting together your gear and trait setups. The combat is made up of your primary attack, which is pretty weak to start off with, but in the later stages of the game will more than likely become your main source of damage, as it isn't dependent on having the mana to cast. Whilst the rest of your damage comes from a selection of spells which you unlock using the talent tree, each character has its own set of 4 abilities, and the characters I've tried start off being pretty dependent on one of these, as they provide high damage quickly, allowing you to take on some of the higher HP enemies. The combat is very basic, and not particularly difficult or absorbing, but it does rely on you positioning your character and luring monsters into areas where you can maximise your damage output for the least mana usage. The abilities are quite varied between the different characters, and it is incredibly pleasing to set off a perfectly placed shot which wipes out an entire wave of evil demons, and there are also another set of powerful artifacts which are either active or passive and can mesh perfectly together and change your gameplay style completely. The various levels are fixed, but all of the crates, traps and monster dens are randomly generated and provide enough of a difference to make revisiting the same levels bearable, and there are enough in the base game with different themes to keep it varied and interesting. It only really starts to become a problem if you end up getting killed repeatedly on the same level, something which became somewhat of an issue on Act 2 when the creatures had the ability to freeze me in place and then go for a full surround before beating me into a pulp. Between the different waves it's also possible that different objectives spawn on the map, such as crypts, dungeons and statues, the latter of which always seemed to curse me every time, so I resorted to ignoring them as the risk didn't seem to be worth it. However, the different crypts and dungeons are more than worth your time as they offer a mixture of puzzles and Indiana Jones style runs being chased by arrow traps, spike pits and the usual kind of deadly booby traps which if you negotiate your way through, 9 times out of 10 will result in a reward which permanently increases your stats, or a particularly epic item. I do quite like the graphical style, which is the usual kind of pixely retro style which we've become accustomed to with the majority of indie games adopting it. But with the perspective and the vast array of colour on display, it certainly stands out from the crowd. There is also a large array of different monsters ranging from giant rats and spiders in the early stages, but develop into flame-throwing goblins and reapers which throw out lightning balls, all of which is drawn in a slightly cartoony and fun way. But it's not completely perfect. Particularly the inventory system, which is awkward and clunky to use, and results in collecting everything and comparing it one by one. Your best bet is probably to go by colour and assume that legendary and mythical items are just fundamentally better. The problems with the inventory system are also particularly noticeable when you're trying to sell items to the shop, and it looks like you're going to sell the items you have equipped. Admittedly you can't actually do this, but it's misleading until you realise you can't. And you get so little for the items, it's basically a waste of time trying to sell them anyway. The game also seems to have a large number of niggly little bugs and problems which occasionally pop up and can potentially end a run or force you to quit and reload, resetting the level. Or for me, a bigger issue was the fact that the Steam Cloud system didn't even seem to work. While these issues are only relatively minor, when you combine them all together it can be slightly off-putting. Overall, I've enjoyed playing Hero Siege, and I'm likely to try increasing the difficulty and keep going if I get the time to do so. One full run took approximately 6 hours including the deaths along the way. It's great mindless entertainment which gives you a sense of progression and challenge while not demanding huge amounts of attention. It makes it an almost perfect time eater. One thing I will say about the progression element of my 2 characters is that it was incredibly slow moving until I got such a huge step in firepower that the difficulty dropped immensely. This is due to the weapon changes. Both times I was using weapons with a base damage of around 20 to 50, and then found one with over 2000 damage which changed everything. It's also possible to play it multiplayer with 4 people online and also 2 players in local co-op, and it would be just great for sitting back and mindlessly slaughtering demons with your mates. However, it can get pretty busy on the screen with 1 player, let alone 4. This game is so cheap that it's not even really worth asking if it's worth it. You're guaranteed to get enough time out of it to justify it.